Thank you for joining us today. A big shout out to Furby House Books in Port Hope. It's their partnership with the Coburg Public Library that allows us to bring authors to the screen. So we are very happy to have that partnership ongoing. We've had many interviews to date online, and our patrons obviously love them. So we will keep doing them. Keep joining us. We're very pleased to have author Kim Covert here with us today. Kim knew at a very early age that she wanted to write. A former journalist, she published her first novel, The Petting Zoos, in May 2022. The Petting Zoos is described as a post-apocalyptic sex adventure and a woman's journey of self-discovery, an erotic love story for an age of extreme caution in which the value of safety itself is questioned. Ashley Pimenter is our host once again today. When she's not curled up with a good book, Ashley creates and supports programming to support the kids who are part of the Girl Guides of Canada. She's also the co-chair of the Red Maple Awards Steering Committee and writes reviews for the Canadian Children's Book News. Welcome, Kim and Ashley.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you again. I'm here with you with Kim Covert with this fabulous book, The Petting Zoos. Oh, Kim, I loved this book so much.
I'm so glad.
I was not expecting it to be at all what it was. So I read the description, and Beth did such a good job describing this book. And I was sure I knew what to expect when I walked in, and I was just regularly surprised. And your protagonist had such a rich lived experience, and I was just like rooting for her the whole time. And I absolutely am enthralled with this book. And it's like, the readers here know that I do a lot of historical fiction. And so this was like doing something that is the antithesis of historical fiction, of like what could have been our present and our history, was such a fun change from what we normally get to see here. And so I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about your process for getting to the Petting Zoos and for sharing this fantastic story with us all.
Well, the story started one day at work. A friend of mine, one of my colleagues, walked into the office and was talking about how he'd taken his son to a petting zoo, and they went regularly because his son loved petting zoos. And I just sort of offhandedly said, wish there were petting zoos for humans. And that night I went home and I wrote a short story. I wrote everything but the end, about a petting zoo for humans. And then I couldn't figure out how to finish it. So I thought, well, how can I make it bigger? And if I can't finish this, what can I do to it? But so I thought about turning it into a novel, but I thought, how can I make this believable? Because I mean, there's things like cuddle parties already, and there's a social isolation that exists that people are trying to overcome. But I thought, well, how can I make it believable that people would go to something like this and that it would be normalized to a certain extent? So I thought, well, I'll put it after a pandemic. That'll make it real. And so, yeah, that was 2009. And then after a lot of writer's block and a lot of false starts, I mean, this is probably the fourth time I started the book. It started out as a political thriller, and then I realized I didn't want to do that. But the first three iterations were a political thriller told in the third person, and it was a much different book. And then I needed to reboot. I needed a new approach, so I changed all the names and I changed everybody's backstory, and I said it in the first person singular, and all of a sudden it took off to a certain extent. So, and I finished it in March 2020, just as the pandemic started. So that was kind of cool. It was eerie in a way, but it was kind of cool too, to be able to go back and see what I'd done and what I'd done right and what needed to be changed. And even though they're completely different pandemics, the one in the book is far more serious than COVID was, but there was still, it helped me sharpen that part of the story a bit, even though it's not about a pandemic, it's the aftermath, but still knowing what happened in COVID helped me sharpen that a bit.
That blew my mind when I was doing some like research ahead of time to be like, look how cool I am. I know all this stuff already. And when I saw that you had finished the first draft of this in March of 2020, I was like, hold on, I feel like I need to know what the next book you're writing is, because you're obviously psychic, so that I can be prepared. And it's so funny because I actually, like, when I read it, I was like, oh, what a great pandemic project. Is the first thing that went through my head. Is I'm like, what a great way to like twist it. And one of the things I did when I was like in my reading journey during the pandemic is I read stories about characters who things were significantly worse than I was living through. And I was like, oh, I don't have to worry about a psychopath who can't die. This is great. Right. Like, it's just a pandemic. But reading yours and this like twist that you put on it, and hearing now that also like you sort of like did a little bit of fact checking along the way, that definitely shows the journalist in you. I love that. What was it like to live through a pandemic after having written about a pandemic?
It was surreal. It was surreal because just seeing all the things that, well, for example, the book is essentially about skin hunger. That was a term I first heard in May 2020. I'd been writing about it for 11 years, but I made it up as far as I knew. and so to see that it was an actual thing was surreal. To be in a pandemic and wearing a mask and was surreal. The first time I went outside without one was December, like between sort of April 2020 and December 2021. The first time I was in a crowd in public was last December, and I could feel what Lily felt that first time she walked, even though it was, you know, the degree of was different, but it was just bizarre. And I was with people who knew what the book was about, and we talked about that, how weird it was to be living the thing I'd only imagined. That was just the only word I really have for it, is surreal. It was. I mean, in parts, I congratulated myself for getting things right, you know, and that was kind of funny. And I just have a quiet chuckle to myself. Yeah, I got that. But for the most part, it was just really strange to see the bits of what it was and what it could become, you know. And it was funny, as COVID went along, I kept thinking about movies and how they present, you know, the growing horror of a thing and everybody ignoring it, you know. And so the first headlines, pandemic declared, and I was thinking about that and thinking, we're not paying as much attention to this as we should be paying. And in 6 months, are we all going to be dead? Right? Because that's how it happens in the movies. That's how it happens in books. And I think, is it going to happen now? So I just got a guest on my lap. So you may have seen the tail. Yeah, no, so it was just really strange watching it all happen.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And I have to admit, as someone who is now like on the other side of the worst of it, I'm going to put that out into the universe and hope that I'm right, because I'm not psychic like you are, is that it was actually also really nice to be like, I'm so glad that this isn't the direction we then had to live through. And as you were describing earlier about it being a political thriller, you still keep some elements of that in here, like just like little hints and little wisps, which I absolutely loved. But one of the things I actually found the most shocking, so I was expecting to pick up like hardcore erotica. I was like, from page 1 to page 10, I was like, this is going to be like sex galore. It's going to be great. Let's see how this goes. And it wasn't just that. It had that. Don't get me wrong. It had some very wonderful, salacious scenes that were absolutely beautiful. And I just loved where you went with it. And I loved the positivity of where you went with these things. It was fantastic. But one of the things you like wove through, which I've never seen in erotica before in any shape or form, was this amazing social commentary. And so it was almost like erotica meets sociology, and this wonderful, like, full human being who had this full lived experience and this full, like, big picture of what was happening. how on earth did you get there from political thing, like political thriller, and like, what if petting zoos were for humans? Like, how did you get to this fully formed character that is Lily and her life experience?
Well, first of all, I never meant to write erotica. And my acquisitions editor, when the first time I talked to him, described the book as a cross between Oryx and Crake and 50 Shades of Grey. And I just kind of, what the hell? Because I deliberately didn't, I thought I had left sex out of it. I mean, there was sex in it, but I didn't think it was a terribly sexual book. And I did that on purpose because I didn't want to write bad sex, because that is so easy to do, right? And when I sent it out to my beta readers, I was stunned when the first one came back and said, "Oh my God, Kim, the sex in this." Well, there's no sex in that, because I deliberately didn't do any description. So, but I obviously wasn't reading the same book. But I started my starting point for the story was social isolation, and why we're isolated and how we're isolated, and what that isolation does to us. I mean, we are more connected now than we've been at any other point in history, really. I mean, I have high school friends that I can talk to regularly. I haven't seen them since high school, but I can talk to. I mean, we're connected, but we are also isolated. So that was kind of my starting point from the book. But I also think that something like a pandemic, a crisis like a pandemic, is it has to create some sort of social upheaval, and some sort of cultural upheaval and moral upheaval, and I was interested in exploring what would change because once, I don't know whether we're talking about God here, but once you have an idea that you are sort of flotsam in the sea of life, and there's nothing looking out for you but you, who are you then? And where does your moral compass point? And I was really interested in exploring that idea. I was far more interested in that than the sex, but apparently the sex kind of jumps out at people. So I found myself apologizing for it quite a bit. A lot of people saying, well, maybe I'm a prude, but so there has been a certain amount of that reaction to it, which is, I'm not sure what to do with that, because for me, the book isn't about sex at all. It's about bigger social questions than that.
Well, and it's interesting because it doesn't start as sex, it starts as touch. And it's just, it's such a good reminder of that importance. And I remember like in the early days when we couldn't hug people, we were like standing 2 feet apart and we're like, oh, this is weird. And people are like, okay, you have to hug yourself at least. Like you have to do something, touch parts of your body that you haven't touched or that others would touch so you can feel it. And just being like, yeah, it starts with that. And like, and you're totally right. The sex is not the whole part of it. And I think part of the reason I'm also fixated on it is that it's so well written and it's beautifully consensual. And I find that so delightful to be like, you know what? This is great. This is consensual adults having a consensually good time. And it's a nice little dessert for me. But you're right. I totally got lost in the rest of the story and I was just rooting for Lily. And I was like, I don't know, Lily, if I was in your spot, I think I'd feel the same. Like she's just such a relatable character. So if anyone is feeling a little prudish, don't worry, read it anyways, because like you might as well get a nice little taste of some spice in your life. But also like you can skip those pages and just enjoy Lily's ride and the twists and turns. And there's a couple of moments in it where I'm not going to do any spoilers because I want you all to experience it, where you're like, oh, I think I know what's going to come. And then you have that like joyful anticipation of like these twists and turns along the way that you're just rooting for Lily and you're rooting for this book throughout. And I absolutely loved that. As you can tell, I'm a huge, like I'm fangirling so hard right now. Like I'm kind of embarrassed.
Oh, I'm so
glad. So this is your first book and I cannot even imagine the process that you went through of this 11 years of creating this spectacular work. And I'm curious, like, what's next for you? Like, do you have another little idea that's percolating? Are you going to stick to your journalism stream that we see a little bit in Lily as well, which is so nice to be like, oh, this is someone who knows what they're talking about this world too.
Yeah, it's funny. One of my editors tried to change a few things and I said, no, this is the way journalists talk. So just leave it. It's good. It was funny when I finally submitted my manuscript to my publisher, I said to my agent, I said, what now? And she said, start the next one. And so I did. I had a couple of ideas. I hadn't let myself work on anything else while I was working on that. So I might have had writer's block for that, but I thought if I start on anything else, it's gone. So I forced myself to finish that one before I could do anything else. But I had this other idea sort of percolating in the back of my head. So I started working on that, and it's kind of out of control right now. But I'm about a third of the way through. It's completely different. It's got some magical realism in it, which is actually more to my taste than what's in the petting zoo. I don't know that I would have picked that book up to read. Maybe, kind of, it pulls at me in some ways, but I ended up writing a book I probably wouldn't have read. So the one I'm writing now is more similar to the things that I like to read. So it's, but I may never finish. I actually formed the idea that I could finish it this summer if I worked at it. And I think that jinxed it. So we'll see what happens.
Every time I think I'm like, oh, I'll just do it over the summer. It never happens. And I'm not even a writer. That's just like, I said I was going to refinish the table. It's August 11th and I haven't started.
Yeah, so I joined a writing group this year to try to give me motivation to write, because they have very strict deadlines. They have very strict word counts, and it's every 2 weeks. You have to submit something every 2 weeks. And as a journalist, I need deadlines. I am not good at self-imposing or directing. I need something outside me to force me to do something. So yeah, that's been very helpful.
That's such great advice. And actually, it's interesting. You're not the first author to come out and be like, it's a group. It's not like, we always think of writing as this solitary task. And it's so interesting because, like, I'm going to hearken to this where Lily lives a solitary life and it's just not enough. And it's so interesting that even as writers, where we think of them as people who are sitting at their computers or writing with a pen or wherever it may be, that they're all on their own. And it's really interesting when that some fantastic authors, and yourself included in this, are like, yeah, it's my writing circle. It's these groups of people who are pushing me to be better and supporting me. So for anybody out there who is experiencing writer's block and has had an idea sitting there for 11 years, Kim is living proof that you can make it happen. And if you check out, there's some writing groups in Port Hope if you're from around here, and just do a quick Google and you can find some friends to help you out as well. You may not need to like physically connect with each other, but as you
I've never met the people in my group where we're online, and we met through an online writers group. Someone put a note saying they were looking for new people in their group, and I had avoided writers groups because I do kind of like the solitary thing, but it was just, I admitted to myself that I needed the outside pressure to actually do something. So yeah, no, writers groups are great. You find, if you have to find some people that you are, I would suggest that you try to be in a group with people who are writing at your level, or better. And because I don't do well with people who don't write as well as me, and that's, that sounds a little arrogant, but I just don't learn anything from them, and I need to be able to learn from them too. So but yeah, find people that you get along with, that you whose advice you trust and or value, and let them take you with them. It can be a really helpful thing.
Thank you, Kim. That was so fabulous. Beth, it seems as if like a lot of these keep turning into like giving little coaching to our aspiring writers, because as we can see, when you put your book into the world, it has so many impacts on so many people. Both the exciting titillation and the social commentary, and just like having one more voice in your head is always a little bit nice to have. So thank you so much, Kim. It was such a pleasure to speak with you and to read your book. And so like, let's do a close up so you can all see it. Like, check out this fantastic evocative cover, to boot. Like, it's just so good. And I highly recommend it. When the Coburg Library gets it in, you need to sign it out.
Please do.
Yes. By the time this airs, the book will be on the shelf. Absolutely. So yes, a reminder to our patrons that they can borrow the book from the Coburg Public Library. You could also pick up a personal copy should you wish to do so from Furby House Books in Port Hope. Kim and Ashley, thank you so much for a delightful conversation. I know our audience is just going to love it. So we're very grateful to have you here with us today, and very grateful for having everyone out there join us. And please come back again. We're happy to have you online with us anytime. Take care.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.